Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about human rights and government policy. So on September 9th, there was a debate of the party leaders, including the Bloc Party of Quebec, the People's Choice Party was not invited because they didn't meet the criteria for getting into the debate. So we will not hear from them. But the debate, it went over why was the campaign called, and because mostly everybody across Canada doesn't agree that they needed to have a federal election in order to move forward with the plans for getting Canada out of the pandemic, as Justin Trudeau says that we had to have this. There was a lot of disagreement. So, but we still need to deal with the issues at hand, the issues that are going to move Canada forward, both economically and also through the pandemic. What is going to provide services for people? What is going to give the most assistance to get Canada back on the road to recovery beyond the pandemic, because eventually the pandemic is going to end. Eventually they're going to figure out a way to bring about a global immunity to COVID-19 that will affect most of the world and protect most of the world from the effects of COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus and its variants. So, for Canada, there was two numbers that really stuck out. That they talked about $6 billion for daycare, because one, we do know that the hardest hit groups were people with disabilities and women. And daycare, the issue of daycare does strongly affect women the strongest, and it does introduce the idea of how do we get women into the workplace so that they can contribute into the overall labor market. The other number is $28 billion, and that would be for provincial health care programs. And there's some very varying ideas on how the party leaders dealt with the idea of, will you give the $28 billion from a federal budget? Will you give the $6 billion from a federal budget? On a couple of occasions, you had Anna May Paul just step up to the plate and say, hey, yes, we would. The Green Party would do that. And on the other hand, you had Erin O'Toole saying that no, they wouldn't do that because they have a plan that would negate the need to produce that $6 billion in the budget. So there's a lot of controversy around daycare and healthcare. There's also a lot of controversy around how to supply workers into the market. As we know that one of the big issues with supplying workers into the marketplace is we have an issue of mandated vaccinations, and we know where Justin Trudeau stands on that, because he would see, if you're not vaccinated, that hey, you don't belong in the workplace. Until you get vaccinated, you shouldn't have a job. To some degree, Jagmeet Singh is going to kind of follow along with that, where businesses that would hire you, he might want to shame them into changing their ways. Anna May Paul and Erin O'Toole have very different ideas than mandating vaccinations. They do believe that people should be vaccinated, especially Anna May Paul. She does believe in the science behind vaccinations, but there should be a way of bringing people to the table and discussing it with them and convincing more people without mandates, without other types of economic prods, to get them to understand the importance of vaccinations and ease their mind about their doubts around those same vaccinations. Erin O'Toole does not believe in mandating vaccinations. He thinks that it should be a matter of choice, and that choice should not appear on a ID card, such as we see the BC vaccination card. So, bringing workers to the table, first we got to get over the COVID-19 hump, and then there's talks about from Jagmeet Singh and also from Anna May Paul where they want to, yes, use immigration, and to use train and educate people that are already here to do the work that needs to actually be done. There are other issues around how to help people get through the pandemic, and Anna May Paul, of course, wants to ensure that there are national standards to protect people like our seniors through healthcare. That Jagmeet Singh wants to make sure that one of the hardest hit things in healthcare also was mental health. He wants to make sure that there are programs for mental health to ensure that these sort of things are looked after long term, not just through the pandemic. And Anna May Paul has an idea that we should be uniting people, bringing people together in order to figure out the problems of the pandemic and to figure out long-term problems that were already there before the pandemic, rather than short-term mandates and ID cards to say, yes, I am, no, I'm not, and splitting people and dividing people over vaccine or anti-vaccine, polarizing our society. She wants to depolarize our society, and in order to get things to move forward. One of the things that was brought up in the French language debate was, are we headed for another minority government that could include 3 parties instead of 2 parties? The thought that, of course, is that Justin Trudeau is not going to get his way and get the majority government that he triggered this whole thing for, that we are going to see in Ottawa a 3-way split of a government. So why don't we, at this point, listen to The debate itself is going to take about 2 hours for you to listen to. It is translated from French into English, so you're going to hear a lot of subtitling going on and translations going on. So let's move forward and listen to that debate that happened last night.
Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Leaders' Debate. We are at the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, in the main gallery that you have seen being transformed into a television studio over the past few days. The debate is being broadcast by a number of partners. It is being interpreted and broadcast in a number of languages. I raise my hat to the interpreters who are working this evening. Good luck, because a debate is very difficult to interpret in real time. The order of speakers has been established by a random draw. Mr. O'Toole, good evening.
Hello.
Mr. Trudeau, good evening. Ms. Paul, good evening. Mr. Singh, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is a very healthy exercise and very valuable in democracy. Sometimes we forget. 5 themes will be dealt with tonight, and each one will be kicked off by a question from someone from the general public. We've received excellent questions tonight. Yes, absolutely. Intelligent questions that have been very inspiring. Well, we're looking forward to them. There will be face-offs between 2 leaders, then between 3 leaders, a question by a journalist to each leader, and the debate will be as open as possible. We are aiming for equal speaking time for all the leaders. Before starting on our first topic, our first segment, I will put a question to all leaders, and you will have 45 seconds to answer. These elections are, forgive me, Mr. Trudeau, we can all agree that people don't want this election. That's in the past. I would like us to look towards the future. Will you commit, if you have a minority government, not to call hasty elections again and to discharge your 4-year term? In other words, Mr. Trudeau, please don't do this to us twice.
Well, thank you, Patrice. First of all, I'd like to thank Canadians.
First of all, I'd like to thank Canadians across the country for being here
this evening with us, but also for everything you've done during the pandemic to get us through the pandemic and to get through this pandemic. I'd like to use Patricia's words, an unwanted election. Here, this evening, you'll hear radical approaches to how we have to put this pandemic behind us, how we rebuild better. And I think you deserve that choice, because the government that you elect will take those decisions now in the fall, not in a year's time, not in 2 years' time, on climate change, on vaccination, on guns. You have an important choice to make, and I'm looking forward to working with you.
M. O'Toole, c'est est-ce que vous engagez, si vous êtes élu à la tête d'un gouvernement minoritaire, de ne pas déclencher d'élections avant 4 ans?
Oui, absolument.
Yes, I certainly do. We have to work together against the pandemic, against the challenges which face us after the pandemic. This is not the right time for an election. But you have to have a plan for the future, as you said, for the future. And at the beginning of this campaign, we set out our plan for economic recovery. A plan has 5 pillars: jobs, anti-corruption legislation, leadership on mental health for Canadians, and a plan also to be more ready in the future for any other pandemic, and a plan to balance the budget. Because after 6 years of Mr. Trudeau, we've got a lot of debts, and we need more opportunities for young people.
The beginning of your answer, were you saying that
we
you
have
would
to work
not
together
an election?
On economic recovery and the pandemic.
You have 45 seconds.
Premièrement, un grand bonjour à tout le monde. Je veux dire clairement qu'on n'a pas voulu d'avoir cette élection parce qu'on veut travailler ensemble. Donc, je m'engage de respecter le mandat des Canadiens et Canadiennes.
Respect the mandate of Canadians and your voice and what you choose. You have an important choice in this election. You have the choice of 4 more years of Trudeau, who let the rich people exploit the system to choose the NDP, who will say clearly that it's the multimillionaires that have to pay their fair share in order to invest in the future of the ordinary people, to face up the climate crisis and to invest in healthcare, and to say clearly that we will settle the crisis of firearms as well. So please choose the NDP.
Will you do everything you can to keep the next government going, regardless of who wins?
Well, yes. I'm not the one who's going to make that decision, of course. I think that a government has to, when it's in a minority position, to garner the support of the number of MPs it needs to be able to stay in power. That's the spirit of the election and the reason why we have fixed dates. So the Prime Minister was saying that I'm kind of surprised that the Prime Minister is saying that he wants to go for a full mandate after triggering elections at the end of 18 months. And 2 weeks after. So the Bloc is going to maintain its philosophy. Whatever it's good for Quebec, we will vote for. If it's not, we will vote against. But we will improve what we vote on so that it serves Quebec in a spirit of cooperation.
All these issues in detail. Ms. Paul, your answer to the same question, please. Will you do everything you can to maintain a government in
First of all, it's an honor for me to be here on unceded Algonquin territory, Miigwech. Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, this is a broken promise by Mr. Trudeau and his government. We are now in this situation, and so we need to find ways to work together in cooperation and collaboration. The fact that we are in the middle of an election is a consequence of the fact that they're not trying to work together. They're working in a hyper-partisan way. People don't want to be consulted on how we're going to end the pandemic. They want the pandemic to end, and they want us to work together.
You are all very disciplined, and so we've made a very good start. Thank you. The first theme, which we clearly cannot avoid, the pandemic and health. Noémie, a first question, please, from the general public. Yes, we've received many. More than 27,000 people have died of COVID-19 in Canada, and at least half died in senior homes, senior residences, often alone and often in dreadful conditions. Our first member of the public is Bernadette Landry. She's in New Brunswick. Good evening, Ms. Landry. Good evening. Thank you very much for being with us tonight and for breaking the ice. You are involved in a New Brunswick association that supports the rights of seniors. You have a question? Yes. The pandemic has opened our eyes to negligence and poor treatment of seniors who are not independent, vulnerable people. So far, provincial governments don't seem to be doing much to prevent that this goes on, because it does go on. It does go on. So if you become Prime Minister, what will you do to ensure that provincial governments protect seniors losing their independence more effectively, and to make sure that they cease to be neglected and ill-treated? Thank you, Ms. Landry. I can confirm that the leaders have listened to your question carefully. Mr. O'Toole, 45 seconds.
Thank you very much for your question, Bernadette. We will take a clear approach to health. The health of Canadians, health of Quebecers, and particularly our seniors. We will increase the health transfer in a stable, predictable, and with no ties attached, up to $60 billion. We will work together on our public system, our universal system, and particularly after the pandemic. We have to learn the lessons of this pandemic. We have to work together on homes for seniors, on long-term care centres also. We have a fund of $3 billion for investment in the long-term care centres and also in seniors' residences. And I respect the jurisdiction of the provinces, but we have to work together.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Ms. Paul?
My father died in a long-term care home during the second wave of the pandemic, and I will never forget this. I will never forget the thousands of people who lost loved ones. And unfortunately, we are forgetting. We need to have a radical approach. We need radical reform of our system. We need to have national standards. We need to make sure that our system is part of the Canadian Health Act. The things that we are protecting are within the Act. We have to provide a minimum amount of care for seniors. We didn't vote for the speech from the throne because there was no plan for seniors.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Blanchet, Ms. Landry says that provincial governments are not doing enough and we can't count on them. What's your answer?
Well, it's really unfortunate what Madame Landry is telling us, because the priority of the health services in the provinces should be to help people. But for that, they need the resources. But the federal contribution to each provinces that have all asked for an increase in health transfers has been woefully inadequate, so that they can. But the provinces need these funds so they can reduce wait times and improve services. So the federal government wants to actually impose conditions on the health transfer under the pretext that the federal government knows better than provinces what they need.
Thank you,
Our position is that provinces are the experts in the area.
Thank you very much, first of all. And thank you, Madame Landry, for the question. Yes, it's national shame what happened during this pandemic. The fact that our seniors were at the hardest hit. It breaks my heart, and you're quite right. We have to help people. And I can't sit standing by when I see people suffering. Yes, I respect the jurisdiction of provinces, but I want to help. I'm looking for a solution. I think that a leader is someone who looks for a solution, not someone who's looking for excuses. So what we're going to do is take a profit out of long-term care facilities to help people. We want to provide more support so that people can stay at home. But Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole voted against that idea.
Conclusion, Mr. Singh. Thank you. Mr. Trudeau, to conclude.
Well, thanks, Ms. Landry, for your question. Like you and like millions of other Canadians, we watched with horror what was going on during the pandemic, what was happening to our most vulnerable seniors across the country, not just in one place in New Brunswick, but across the country, nationwide, and we have to do better. The federal government sent in the Canadian forces to help. We have to learn from that, and we have to realize that the situation of our seniors wasn't just bad during the pandemic. It's been bad for years now. The federal government will always respect our provincial jurisdiction, but we have a role to play to get results. So we're proposing to take on 50,000 PSWs and also to pay them $25 an hour, because working conditions mean that they'll be able to provide better care. And we're there for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. Ms. Landry, we saw your reactions as you heard the answers. Are you satisfied with the answers? Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you for having taken part in this. That's very encouraging. Thank you, Ms. Landry. We'll come back to this on the open debate, to the issue of health, long-term care homes. But first of all, a face-off between Ms. Paul and Mr. Singh. I'd like to talk about vaccines. Ms. Paul, it's not quite clear whether you are for or against mandatory vaccination. I didn't quite understand your answers when you were last asked. Mr. Singh, you are very much for mandatory vaccination, and you're not concerned that this will further inflame the protesters and those who are really against being vaccinated? Don't you fear being divisive?
It's so sad to see the politicization of the issues, and this issue in particular, which is public health. Absolutely. We believe that each person that can be vaccinated should be vaccinated. I believe that I totally agree with this.
I agree fully, Madame Paul. That's exactly what we have to do. We have to help people become vaccinated we have to provide more resources to help them. I don't want to divide the population. What I want to do is protect the population. But that's the reason why I also want to come back to Madame Landry's question. What happened in long-term care facilities, as Madame Paul said, it was horrible. But what we learned is that in these long-term care facilities, with the for-profit ones had the worst conditions, and that is why Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Trudeau are in favor of private medicine.
But if we come back to vaccination, I'm coming back to vaccination. I wanted to say that that was half of my answer. I also wanted to say that it's very clear that we are going to need accommodations for people who cannot be vaccinated. There are rapid screening tests, there are other options available, and we know full well how to use these tools. So to use something that should be guided by science.
Very well, thank you. I'd like to hear Mr. Singh. Do you agree with what the government of Quebec said, that those who don't want to be vaccinated should stay home and not get paid?
I say that, yes, there have to be consequences, but we should do everything we can to help people become vaccinated. We can find other ways to help people. There's those who can't be vaccinated, and we can find other solutions for them.
Yes, and also, I want to know what these consequences actually are, because if we can unite and agree, it's much better.
Right. Well, that's why I'm putting the question. Both of you have nuances in your answers, and sometimes people find them difficult to understand. Mr. Blanchet, Mr. Trudeau, and Mr. O'Toole. Mr. Trudeau, we've been seeing you surrounded by protesters since the start of the campaign, so the same question to you. Aren't we seeing a vicious circle being created here in Canada? The more you insist on mandatory vaccination, the more protests we see. So we've politicized the issue.
Well, it's a false debate, isn't it, Patrice? Everyone knows that vaccination is the way we'll get through this pandemic. That's what science and our best researchers are telling us. I'd like to make a distinction between the hordes of people who are demonstrating and those people who are hesitating to get vaccinated. We have to inform these people, but you also have to show that it's in their best interest to get vaccinated. They won't be able to take a train, a plane. They won't be able to work for the federal public service either. And with vaccine passports that will pay for, they won't be able to go to gyms or movie theatres. It's important to tell people clearly that they need to get vaccinated because 80% of Canadians have done what needed to be done.
Mr. O'Toole, you haven't changed your mind. You are against mandatory vaccines.
Well, vaccinations are absolutely crucial. They're safe, they're effective, and I encourage all Canadians, all Quebecers, to get vaccinated. But in the middle of a pandemic, that's not the right time to present a divisive approach. We have to work together, every level of the government. We have to use all the tools, vaccinations, rapid tracing tests, masks, social distancing. But in the middle of a pandemic, why did Mr. Trudeau call an election? We have to work against the fourth wave, not an election campaign.
Mr. O'Toole is drawing a link between vaccination and testing, and it's not at all the same thing. When you test positive, it means that you're already sick.
Why did you call an election, Mr. Trudeau, during a pandemic? Why did you do that?
Well, look.
Ask Canadians about that. We have to fight together against COVID-19, not with a divisive approach.
You asked me a direct question. Why are we having this election during the pandemic? Well, because there are very, very important decisions that need to be made at how we get through this pandemic. I think compulsory vaccination required to take a plane. I believe in that. Mr. O'Toole doesn't believe in that. That's a clear choice, and Canadians should decide.
Yes. Well, first of all, said in plain terms, there was a grocery owner in my neighborhood. It says, I wouldn't set the fire, but I wouldn't either extinguish it. So we need to educate and incite people to go get vaccinated. But right now, this confrontation is sterile. It leads to nothing.
Doing that for months, Mr. Blanchet.
I have the right to speak, please. So, in addition, the examples that Mr. Trudeau is giving are about the borders and transportation, but these are all jurisdictions of Quebec. Quebec is the authority that decides in terms of gyms and other public spaces and the constraints.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Thank you, all three of you. We'll come back to the five-way debate in a moment. My colleagues will be with us later, and there will be questions for all of you. We are going for both open debates and individual questions so that people understand what you really think. Ms. Paul, this is a random order. Pharmacare, dental insurance, more money for long-term care homes. Your program is very ambitious, but it hasn't been costed. How can we take you seriously?
We are costing it out. And also, we can say that we have been participating in elections for 2 years. We had a completely costed program last time, but I would like to say that unfortunately, here we are in election campaign, and it's the time to be ambitious. I believe that the pandemic has changed things. It has completely changed myself and my family, and I think that people want to take a different path. We don't want to take the same path. To do that, we have to say yes. Yes, we have to be ambitious. We have to be bold. And we're going to suggest that everyone live a life of dignity here in Canada. We have everything that we need for that.
But your program isn't costed.
Not yet.
There are only 2 weeks left. When will we see the prices?
It will be costed. This election was called for over 36 days.
Mr. Blanchet, you have, of course, talked about areas of provincial jurisdiction, and people are very aware of that, especially in Quebec. But why would you deny any cooperation with the federal government? Why would you refuse any cooperation? Because there have been 5,718 deaths in long-term care homes in Quebec, much more than in Ontario. So would this not be the time to be open and a little more modest?
The reasoning that you're suggesting is that because it was the Quebec system or because it was the Quebec norms, it's not as good as if it had been standards set by the federal government. But in fact, the federal government doesn't hire nurses, and the federal government has in fact been withholding funds. And if those funds had been made available to the provinces who are dealing with all of these needs, then we would have had a more robust system, more efficient to face the crisis. So I don't have a precise explication, and I don't want to lose myself in conjecture.
Right. Mr. O'Toole, do you believe that Canadians should have a choice of paying for care to receive care more quickly?
No. I'll always respect provincial jurisdiction. And I respect the decisions of the provinces. As Mr. Blanchet said, this is a matter of provincial jurisdiction. I will increase health transfers. I'll do that in a stable, predictable way and without any ties. It's a matter of respect for me. And I trust the Quebec government. Why has Mr. Trudeau always encroached in provincial jurisdiction, particularly after the pandemic, after the sad situation in the long-term care centres? We have to work together for the well-being of Canadians, of Quebecers, and that's why we have a plan for Canada's recovery and historic, unprecedented investments in our healthcare system.
So, not a greater portion of private healthcare.
I support our public system.
Mr. Trudeau, a very simple question for you. How much does a vaccine dose cost? We've seen figures coming out of Europe. Should Canadians not know whether we had a good deal or whether we didn't?
What Canadians do know is that we've invested a lot of money to be at the head of the pack among all countries in terms of vaccination. We have enough vaccines for everyone. We paid competitive prices.
But why won't you say how much each costs?
Well, these are contracts with private companies. We're trying to be as transparent as possible here. I'd like to pick up on the response from Mr. O'Toole. He doesn't seem to understand that it's the role of the federal government to defend the Canada Health Act, which prevents private health care. in all the provinces. He's not standing up against a two-speed system. And Mr. Singh, or Mr. Blanchet, seems to forget, rather, that there were federal doctors, federal physicians in the long-term care facilities when the army went in.
Well, we'll soon have more time to talk about these issues. Mr. Singh, still on the pandemic, you're proposing mental health care that would be free of charge for all those who suffered from the pandemic, who have repercussions. But there are 910 spaces for psychologists and no psychologists to fill them.
Yes, it is a serious issue and problem, but we have to point out how during this pandemic we faced problems even before the pandemic to have access to mental health services. This situation became worse during the pandemic itself, and it was a very difficult time that had a lot of severe impacts on the mental health of so many people. So what we want to do is ensure that people have access to these as essential services, in other words, including mental health services as part of the basic health care. I know that it won't be easy, but it's necessary, and that's what we'll do.
Right. The open debate, 5 minutes. Mr. O'Toole, you begin. Canada has just opened its borders to those with 2 doses of vaccines, international borders. Are you concerned about that?
We have to have a safe border in the middle of a pandemic, and that's why we have to use the level of vaccinations for other countries, particularly the United States. But we also have to use a tracing test, fast tracing tests at the border. And I proposed this a year ago, but unfortunately, as usual, Mr. Trudeau's government weren't there for these rapid testing systems. In the middle of a pandemic, they didn't have the vaccines. In the middle of a pandemic, it's possible to have an open border, but a safe border, and that's very important during the pandemic.
First of all, we know that we're now starting to see a fourth wave among those who are not vaccinated. Those who have done their duty, have done what they need to do for society, who are vaccinated, are not a risk, and they can come back to normal life. And we're now able to welcome travellers from other countries who are fully vaccinated because we want to get back to normal life. But the reality is that we're making sure that people are vaccinated before they come here, and we want to compensate those people who are doing what they had to do. And I don't understand why the 2 leaders are not taking a stand on vaccinations.
We're in a fourth wave of COVID-19. Mr. Trudeau, it was the wrong thing to do to launch an election when we know that we still have to face up to pandemic challenges, in particular because the only reason for which you launched this election was for a selfish reason to have more power. It's not the right thing to do. So, in our opinion, we should have continued to fight against the pandemic, to deliver for people, and to realize that the pandemic is just not over. There are still issues to be corrected, and we have to act. So why did you launch the election? It's nonsense.
I totally agree with Mr. Singh on this point. We do have options. We can make people feel guilty if they're not vaccinated, or we can try to educate them. We can try to unite people. We've already spoken of the need to invest in mental health services, to invest in the long-term care homes. We have to be at the House of Commons discussing these types of things, working together and finding the assistance that people need. We are still in the middle of a pandemic.
Mr. Blanchet, are you concerned about the borders?
I agree on the principle that double vaccination is an interesting standard, but I think it has to be coordinated with the other countries where there are more visitors. But I wouldn't have submitted my platform 2 weeks later after the start of the election and changed it the next day. So I think that Canada needs exchange. Even the President of the American president doesn't want to talk with the Prime Minister for the opening of the main Pacific border in the world. So I think that there are stakes here,
to respond to the question on elections, viewers are starting to see now just how different, just how deep the differences are in our vision in terms of how we put this pandemic behind us. And this election really is the opportunity for Canadians to choose. But you haven't asked us what our plan is for health. We're proposing $25 billion investment in GPs, in mental health over the next 4 years. And we will do this. Unfortunately, we want to work with the provinces, but we have responsibilities, we have duties as well.
I'll allow you each to answer with yes or no. Mr. Blanchette?
But it's my right.
28 billion.
Are you going to transfer?
Yes or no?
I'm going to absolutely insist that the transfers to the provinces.
To the provinces.
So, 28 million billion for the provinces?
Yes or no? Increase the
but not by 28 billion.
Yes, we want to increase them.
There's always a vagueness to the answer.
We invited provinces to be at the table with the government, with the federal government, to create and to negotiate. Well, it's not a negotiation. It's the creation of a fundamental reform.
Trudeau, yes or no?
25 billion, yes.
25 billion.
25 billion for health. We'll work with the provinces to get results. 25 billion.
Well, we said what we'd give over the next decade without any ties attached, because it's a question of respect.
Very well, thank you all. That concludes our first open debate. The cost of living and public finances. A question from the public. The labor shortage is severe and is very difficult for businesses. It is also disrupting communities. We're going to speak to someone who has been affected by that. We are with Marc-André, Mr. Marc-André Poulin in Chaudière-Appalaches. Good evening. Good evening, Noémie. You work for a small business in La Beauce that builds hardwood floors. You're having trouble finding workers. What do you want to ask? All economic sectors in my region have labor shortages. We see companies who cannot accept projects. They have to slow down their growth because they don't have workers. Community organizations have serious problems as well. Can't recruit and often can't provide services. That's my question. What is your party's plan to help with the labor shortage? Thank you for that question, and it's very clear. What can you do to deal with the labor shortage?
Thank you very much. I missed the family name, Mr. Poulin.
The gentleman's name is Marc-Antoine Poulin.
My apologies, your name escaped me. Yes, this is a serious issue, and you raised it. In your region, you talked about how industries and businesses are facing up to this difficulty. It's the same throughout the country. So we do have some solutions that we think that we can use our immigration system to draw new arrivals, attract them, that will help us fight against this labor shortage. We could also use education, in other words, training, to connect the education system with the businesses that need labor.
Mr. Blanchette.
I do have a proposal for you, Monsieur Poulin. First of all, temporary suspension of CERB, because that program is actually preventing people from going back to the workplace. I would make an exception, of course, for arts and tourism. And the program for young retirees that could continue to work at least part-time, and also opening immigration is subject to the ability to integrate people. You want people who can work in French, and that's important to remember. And the other thing that we should look at is that we want perhaps a tax credit could help in the community sector.
Well, first of all, thanks, Mr. Poulin. I remember coming to Le Beauce several years ago, and entrepreneurship and economic activity is well known. Well, the labor shortage It's a major issue. It was during the pandemic, but also before the pandemic. That's why we've invested and continue to invest in training, jobs training, and also in immigration. But there's also a job hiring incentive which will help you to increase the wages that you can pay to your employees to encourage people to work for you. Because we know that the economic recovery has to be quick, prompt, and across the country.
Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Mr. Poulin. I have a great deal of respect for business people from La Beauce, and the shortage of manpower is a problem in all regions, and we really have to address this. And that's why it's in our contract with Quebecers. And I will give more power in terms of immigration for Quebec, and this is very important, particularly for foreign workers. In the agricultural sector, for example, they are absolutely crucial. You have to have these workers. We also need a cooperation-based approach. And we have to reduce the problems, for example, problems affecting such as the CERB, because there's a shortage. We have to focus on work, on jobs after the pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. Ms. Paul, you conclude this section.
Thank you, Mr. Poulin, for this question. Once again, this is an example of an issue where we should be discussing at the House of Commons. Citizens and businesses need assistance because we are in the middle of a pandemic. Immigration, training, coordination and collaboration, we need to coordinate with businesses in order to know where there are shortages and how we can improve the situation. We need to have training that corresponds to the needs of businesses, and I know that workers want this as well, and immigration. We are a country that can welcome many new Canadians. That's a solution.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Poulin, thank you very much for having shared your views with you. Do you feel enlightened by the answers? Yes, indeed. Very instructive. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Poulin. Have a good evening. Thank you, Mr. Poulin. We appreciate your participation and the question, because the labour shortage is certainly something we hear a lot about when we travel across the country. Mr. Blanchet, Mr. Trudeau, in a two-way debate. First of all, Mr. Blanchet, you say that except for the cultural sector, the recovery benefit should be ended.
Because I want it to be a cordial exchange rather than confrontation. What we're saying is that after touring regions of Quebec, what we've observed more often than not is that businesses, and in particular small businesses in services sector, because large businesses, of course, are competitive and they can attract people. So restaurants are closed, gas stations are closed. The community is saying that if somebody wants to go to the following, to the next community, they'll have to borrow a car. And people asked us, could we stop CERB? Well, it seemed because there could be a fourth wave that's even stronger, and maybe a fifth one. We don't know what the future could happen. So this program could be useful, except in the area of tourism and arts. I think that the program should be suspended for the
So you'd like to see an end to the recovery benefit or suspended?
As I crisscross Quebec, this is a question people ask. The pandemic didn't create the labour shortage. It wasn't CERB or the CRB that created either. We've reduced the CRB to $300 a week, which is below the minimum wage, and we recognise that to ensure stronger economic recovery, we must invest. We must support businesses. We must support hiring by businesses. This is why we've created a hiring incentive, and why we've continued to increase immigration and to work on jobs training. And also direct support for businesses will continue to be there for people. That means workers, but it also means businesses. This is what we did during the pandemic, and this is what we'll continue to do.
I invite the government, whoever it may be, to work on productivity. So how are we going to create more wealth with less people? So we have to work on productivity. And you can't announce new jobs because productivity of the businesses
well, that's what we're doing.
Is the important thing.
We have a digital program for small businesses so that they can make the digital transition, so that they can be more productive.
Very well. You'll have an opportunity to come back to that. Thank you. That was indeed a cordial exchange. Mr. O'Toole, Ms. Paul, Mr. Singh, I'd like to come back to the recovery benefit, Mr. O'Toole. If you become Prime Minister, what happens at the end of October?
We have to reduce these programs in equitable way.
Stop or reduce?
If there's no risk, in fact, of a fifth wave of the pandemic, we have to focus on health, on the well-being of Canadians and Quebecers. But we need an economic recovery. We see the hotel industry, restaurants, the tourism industry as a crisis in all of them, and we have a specific plan for those small companies.
I don't agree, completely don't disagree. What we've seen is that someone doesn't work because they're receiving $1,200. That isn't a problem with the subsidy. It's a question of salaries. People want to work. But I'd like to return to the topic of the cost of living. The cost of living increases the price of houses. Mr. Trudeau talks about $600 to help something, but while he was Prime Minister up until now, the cost of purchasing a house increased considerably. All of these things increased. Mr. Singh will talk about.
We'll talk about that in a moment. Right now, we're talking about the recovery benefit. You would
so
like it to
continue with these
carry on?
Yes, we do. We have to help people. We're in a fourth wave of the pandemic.
I'd like to invite the leaders that think that it's a time to end benefits to come to my riding, and they can see marginalized citizens, people working in essential services, and they still need CRB to survive, and it's not even enough. They are threatened by evictions, and we do need these benefits. I would go even further to say that it's the time to consider how these benefits, these emergency benefits, will be replaced with a guaranteed income, a minimum guaranteed income. We see that there are gaps.
I agree. And what we've seen during the pandemic is that follows on Mr. Trudeau's decision, rather than ensuring that big businesses who took public subsidies and used it in a bad way, rather than doing that,
really, he had the option.
We should cut their.
With the NDP and Mr. Trudeau, we'll have unlimited spending.
You're on the same side. You take money out of people's pockets.
They're going to double some of these allowances. And I will work very, very hard to help the workers.
It's always a great investment. Investing in people.
Right. Ms. Paul. Thank you. I would now like to ask my colleague, Ms. Hélène Buzzetti, to ask a question. And while she settles in, I would remind you that if you speak at the same time, you're all very hard to hear. This will be the last time I will remind you of this. Ms. Buzzetti. Mr. Trudeau, we'll begin with you. This year, inflation reached 3.7%. That is a 10-year record. Gasoline, groceries, everything is costing more, and everyone says that it is because of your massive spending in part. So what guarantee do we have that the extra billions you are proposing to keep spending will not raise the cost of living even further?
But the investments we're making, such as $10 daycare spaces and more spaces in Quebec, like investment to help families to save for a down payment of their first house, investment we're making to support the culture industry, the tourism industry, workers across the industry. Well, we're there to support people. I made a promise at the start of the pandemic to have people's backs as long as they needed it. And that's really allowed us to build
but
economic
Mr. Trudeau,
growth.
isn't that to overheat things? Inflation will rise, interest rates will rise, so what will happen to people with large mortgages?
Economic growth. We will manage inflation because we have to keep things affordable for families.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. Mr. O'Toole, you tabled your costed platform only a couple of hours ago, so please forgive us if we haven't had time to go through it in detail. If we understand, you're maintaining almost all the spending in the former Liberal budget. You're adding conservative spending, and you are still going to get rid of the deficit. Please explain how, because I don't get it.
Canada's economic recovery, we're going to balance the budget over the next decade with an economic recovery in every sector and in every region. And that's why we will have investments to help families, to help also in terms of mental health, small and medium business that are in difficulty. But we need an economic recovery. We need a strong economy, and we have a plan to achieve that. And there's a crisis with the cost of living at the moment because of the unmet spending of Mr. Trudeau's government.
But you are promising to maintain that spending, so how can you reconcile the two? Is this the magical O'Toole effect?
We have a plan to balance the budget, but we have to create jobs. And our first objective is to create 1 million jobs in 1 year.
That's all the time we have. Mr. Blanchet.
Yes.
Everything indicates that we're going into a very much a minority government. So we'll need two opposition parties, or the government will need two opposition parties. What conditions would have to be met for you to support a budget that would include, for example, 27 billion? Is that non-negotiable?
And so I'm asking myself, at this point in the campaign, are there major parties that deserve a majority? Has somebody shown that they deserve that, with Jean Charest, two hands on the wheel? But do they have a plan, a vision that will bring somewhere? So the Bloc Québécois looks at all of this and decides what's good.
What is your red line?
But yes, it's an absolute
But the
condition.
three major parties have not committed to paying those billions.
There's a lot of low appreciation for what the Quebec can do. But all of the provinces are saying transfers without conditions.
That's all the time we have.
So it's 28 billion plus 6% per year. That's what provinces are asking for.
Mr. Singh, you are proposing to spend billions more than the Liberals. And you're saying that you will make the ultra-rich pay, and you mentioned Amazon as well. But Mr. Singh, Jeff Bezos is in the U.S., and we always underestimate the revenue that we can get from fighting tax evasion. So what do you say to people who believe your plan is magical thinking?
It's a question of equality. If you work here in Canada and you have a business here in Canada, you should pay your fair share. But the web giants don't pay their fair share. It's unfair. So we've seen businesses started out, and we said we'll tax their revenue. So what we're saying is we're ready to invest in people, but not like Mr. Trudeau or Mr. O'Toole, who will cut assistance to people or put more pressure on people. We're the only party with a credible plan that says we're going to ensure that the billionaires play their fair share.
Will that money actually appear? I'm thinking about your estate tax. The wealthy can move their assets.
Well, I think that, first of all, the tax on revenue, we can stop the tax havens and other loopholes. These are good measures to gain more money to invest in ordinary people.
Ms. Paul, in conjunction with Mr. Singh, you are the second party not yet to present a costed platform, but you do promise a minimum universal income. When we look at the size of the deficit, can we really afford a permanent emergency response benefit?
The PBO's office has already said that yes, it's possible, and yes, it's possible with a guaranteed minimum income. Almost 50% of people would be lifted out of poverty. And of course we can pay for this. And we know that despite all our collective efforts, that there are gaps. And each time someone in a country, a rich country such as Canada, has these types of gaps, it's a shame.
We are hearing a lot about labor shortage and 800,000 empty jobs. How do we
we have to
pay for people
a livable income so that they can pay their rent? This is the time to have a guaranteed minimum income. And
Thank you. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Ms. Paul. Now, the open debate. You will all have the right to speak. The random draw means we begin with Mr. Singh. But please speak as clearly as possible about daycare. We've seen that Labour shortages in Quebec exist, and it has been tremendously helpful for women to have a daycare program that allows them to go to work. So what is going to happen with the $6 billion? I'd like to hear that. Mr. Singh, is that
Excellent
a good idea?
I'd like
the
to
daycare
salute
program.
all the activists who pressed the government to deliver the goods. But I'd like to note that Mr. Trudeau and his party have been promising that for 30 years. 30 years they promised to do it. And finally, they started getting deals with the province. But the big question is, if Mr. Trudeau really wanted to do something, why did he launch an election instead of continuing the work? It's completely unacceptable, and people cannot believe that Mr. Trudeau because of that.
Mr. O'Toole, your costed platform was unveiled a few hours ago, and it is clear that there will be no $6 billion for daycare for Quebec and the other provinces. No check for daycare will be sent to Quebec. You will have a tax credit program.
We're going to help all Quebec families immediately. And we're going to help low-income families with an amount of 75%. And I will always respect the provincial jurisdiction, including the system in Quebec. And that's why we will coordinate with Mr. Legault's government in close cooperation. And we have a budget in our platform. And we
but you won't send a $6 billion check.
Because our plan will help all families in Quebec. And families, in fact, will benefit from this.
Thank you.
Straight away, not in 5 or 6 years.
Mr. O'Toole fails to understand the Quebec daycare system that we've used as inspiration for the rest of the country. He says he'll send a tax credit to the most vulnerable families in Quebec. The most vulnerable families in Quebec don't pay for daycare services covered by the province. So they'll get nothing. They'll get nothing.
Families will receive more assistance.
What he intends to do is to not send that $6 billion to Quebec, which will create 37,000 daycare spaces. Quebec families have been waiting for months and years to get a daycare space. He's going to say no to them. We're not going to get a space.
But why did you launch an election?
Create 250,000 spaces across the country, and Mr. O'Toole wants to scrap that.
Monsieur Roy, so let's talk about the Conservative plan. They talk about their plan all the time. So $6 billion less for the Quebec government. So I want to see how the Conservatives are going to gush forth their affection for Quebec and how Monsieur Legault is going to react to it. And the other thing is that Monsieur Trudeau this exceptional, Monsieur Trudeau finds that the system that was created by Madame Marois is exceptional, but that's a proof that the programs that are created by Quebec and administered by Quebec are competent and sufficient. We don't need the federal government to put its nose in our affairs to do well.
I'm wondering if all the men here will allow a woman to speak on an issue that impacts women more than anyone else. And I'm also wondering if the other party leaders here, if there were more women representing parties, if it would have taken decades to have something that is a right and that's necessary so that women can enter the workplace. So yes, absolutely, for universal daycare, of course. And yes, it's too late for myself and other women. It's too bad that we were not able to do this during the last session.
We have understood your positions. Mr. O'Toole, you're saying that you have a different idea, so you will not be sending $6 billion to Quebec.
Coordinate with the government. We have a budget in our platform which has been costed because we have to work with the provinces.
Your program doesn't include $6 billion. Thank you. So far, the discussion's going quite well, and you are staying within your time. Let's move to the next topic. The environment, a crucial theme. And there is a very interesting question. It is rare that it is unusual for us to have seen the impact of climate change so immediately. Canada has been suffocating. Heat waves killed hundreds of people in the West. It was 49.5 degrees Celsius in Lytton in British Columbia, and that is a record. Canada is warming twice as fast as the world average. So we know the planet is warming, and we have to drastically reduce GHG emissions. That is a problem that concerns young people who will have to deal with the repercussions of today's decisions. Charles Leduc is 11, and he is in Saint-Cloud, Montérégie. Good evening, Charles.
Bonsoir.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Welcome to the Leaders' Debate. When you look around and see wildfires, hurricanes that are more frequent and more severe, what is the question you'd like to put to our leaders? Yes, I am worried. So what will you do to reduce the use of fossil fuels here in Canada? Charles, you're not just concerned about your own future. Yes, I'm concerned about the children I'll have one day as well. Thank you, Charles. Here is an 11-year-old child who's worrying about his children's future. Mr. Trudeau, what is your answer?
Well, first of all, thanks, Charles, for being with us this evening. Thanks for your question. It's a question that I hear regularly across the country, not only from my own country, but from kids like you across the country. This is why we have put in place an ambitious plan, a very simple plan. We've put a cap on emissions from the oil and gas industry to reduce them to net zero eventually. We know that we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from those two sectors. We'll also make sure that everyone can buy electric cars by 2035. All new cars in 2035 will be electric. These are two concrete steps we're making for you and your generation, Charles.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you very much for the question. My children are young, like Charles, and it's environment to climate change. It's very important for me as a father. And that's why in April we launched our policy on climate change. And we have to achieve our objectives, the Paris objectives. And we have a plan to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, while at the same time creating jobs and opportunities after the pandemic. We have a plan with a great deal of details, Charles, with a price on carbon, with a personal account also for carbon, and we'll use a technology, for example, sequestration, capturing hydrogen, and we'll also have a cooperation-based approach on electric vehicles.
Thank you.
We'll be acting on this, Charles.
Thank you, Ms. Paul.
Thank you, Charles, for your question. We invited many youth leaders for roundtables over the past few months. It's something that is very concerning, Charles. We're trying to be a party that unites people, but when it comes to the climate, we are very, very unique. We know that it's impossible to invest in pipelines, in drilling, or in fracking, and to reach our climate targets. There is only one choice in this election when it comes to the climate, but we do want to work with other parties.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Mr. Blanchet.
Well, dear future dad, the International Panel on Climate determined that Canada is not a good student when it comes to climate change. It's not by investing in the petroleum industry to the tune of $6 billion per year or billions more in buying a pipeline that's going to transport petroleum, and it's thinking that it's going to allow us to reduce our greenhouse gases. So we have to fix a threshold and then go down. And we are ready to subsidize Alberta to do it. And we also launched the idea today that we should finance the petroleum industry's transition to green energy.
Thank you, and congratulations, Charles. Unbelievable. You've asked a question. Many people saw it. My congratulations. What I'd like to say is that it's very important for me, too. I will be a dad pretty soon, and I have plans for my child. And it's really an issue that we have to face up to. Mr. Trudeau here said he wants to reduce at greenhouse gas emission missed all its targets. He keeps subsidizing the gas sector and not taxing the great polluters. We want to eliminate subsidies to the oil sector, and we want to give you a brilliant future. That's my commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Thank you, Charles. You asked a question that many Canadians are also asking. Stay involved and have a great evening. Thank you, Charles. Thank you. We appreciate your question. Thank you. Bye. I will continue on the same subject, Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Blanchette. The question that people are asking is quite simple, Mr. O'Toole. You will answer first. How to reduce GHG emissions while increasing oil production?
Well, it's possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while at the same time creating jobs. We'll have programs on carbon neutrality in the energy sector in Western Canada. And we'll use technology such as hydrogen here in Quebec. And we'll have a partnership-based approach with major emitters to reduce our emissions. And that's why we launched our platform in April. It's an important challenge. And we have to restore confidence and we have to restore trust in this. But we have a plan for achieving our goals, while at the same time creating jobs for economic recovery.
So I think that this fairy tale is going to turn into a pumpkin. It's impossible to diminish our GHG emissions while we still continue to produce and transport petroleum. But it is possible to create more wealth if we invest in green energy, innovation, and the transformation of our own natural resources in the various regions of Quebec and in our own research centers. There are ways of doing more, better, and to export this knowledge. And this is rather than just investing in fossil energy.
Mr. Blanchet, you said that. It is possible to use technology with carbon capturing, sequestration.
Well, what I said.
And you can use that.
I said.
And for example, like we've seen with aluminum in the Saguenay, we have to have a good economic recovery in the regions. And you've made decisions as a former minister for the environment in Quebec, and you did in fact approve
which decisions I took?
Major emitters in Quebec. But we have to work in close cooperation with the provinces.
Mr. Blanchette, I will let you reply, but I will quote you, and I'm quoting you. I will say, without any hesitation, that the Quebec government plans to go forward with exploiting the oil sector in Quebec, February 14th, 2013. So you did believe in oil for Quebec?
Yes, I was part of the government. I said at a Minister of Environment what my government was saying, and that everybody was sincere. My job was control. So there had to be an environmental assessment after the exploration stage. And I think that everybody here went to the same school, and that's what I did for 8 years. So let me repeat. I didn't say that sequestration was a solution. I said that it didn't exist except in the forests.
There has been a reply. Next speaker, Ms. Paul, Mr. Singh, Mr. Trudeau. I'll come back to the major dilemma Canada has, an oil-producing country that wants to be green at the same time. For the past 25 years, the two things don't seem compatible.
It's not, because we know even if we can't make the transition overnight, it will come in the coming years. We're starting to see what the investments we're making are actually doing in transforming our energy sector. This is why we'll put a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector to bring them down to carbon neutrality. We'll invest in electric vehicles to help everyone to buy one. Unfortunately,
I have to add something. Go ahead. Honestly, you had 6 years to do something, and I'm sorry about that. It's not with any joy that I'm saying this, but in 6 years, you have the worst record of the G7 countries. The reality is that you promised to eliminate subsidies to the oil and gas sector. Good idea. But instead of doing it, you actually increased these subsidies. How can people believe in you?
We are the only party that clearly states that we will stop building pipelines. We will stop supporting fracking. We are not going to support the oil sector. And I am the sister of a person who used to work in the oil and gas sector in Alberta. I'm saying this. The future in Canada, yes, it's energy, but it's renewable energy. Unfortunately, we are behind all our international partners. There's a green rush ongoing right now. The future is green.
I agree completely with you, Madame Paul. What we have to do is make serious decisions because we have a big challenge in front of us. We have to invest in renewable energy. We have to electrify transport. But we can't simply go along with Mr. Trudeau's line of contact. Big talk, no action.
No, I'd like to respond, please. What we're seeing, well, all parties are saying we're serious on the environment because we're a country based on science and which respects science. The reality is that we need to do what our experts and our environmentalists are saying, what climate experts are saying as well. They're all saying that it's the Liberal Party that the only party that has a real plan.
Thank you. That concludes this segment.
They're the only party that has a real plan.
Thank you. Mr. Trudeau. Very well. Mr. Trudeau.
We're the only party with a plan for the environment.
I would now invite Paul Journet to ask his question to the leaders. Mr. Singh, you would like to help cities to make public transit free of charge, but they can't even afford their current services. So how can they afford that?
Yes, we want to invest in collaboration with municipalities to help them with transit because we know that they're one of the big producers of greenhouse gas emissions, transport generally. If we can invest in transit and if we can electrify it and if we can help municipalities by working together with the provinces and territories, this will really help in our fight against the climate change.
But if somebody earns $100,000 a year, should they ride the bus for free?
I think it's an option. So we'll give the option to the municipalities to do what they want. But what we want to do is invest a huge investment in transit because it's important to do that.
Mr. Trudeau, you want to cap oil and gas emissions, but you are still granting drilling permits in Newfoundland. When will you put an end to new projects?
First of all, with a cap on emissions from the gas and oil sector, it's going to be very, very tough to create investment in the oil and gas industry because we have to reduce emissions. That's what we need. Over the various years, we've looked at projects and we've applied rigorous criteria in terms of approving them. But we will continue to put a price on carbon and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
If I may, when will you cap it and how fast will you reduce it? Is it going to be a steep descent?
Well, it will be what needs to be done. It will be decided by experts. They're guiding us. For the past 4 or 5 years, emissions have been capped. They're not going up.
Ms. Paul, in 2021, all federal parties have produced a plan on the environment. The leader of the Green Party in British Columbia says that your plan is not the best. Has your party ceased really to
No, that's wrong.
have a reason for existing?
And I'm a lawyer, I'm an analyst, and I am extremely pragmatic. But when I was looking to join a party, I was asking myself which party had the best plan for our future, and it is the Green Party. we know full well it's impossible to continue extracting oil and gas, to continue building pipelines, and to continue giving the green light to these exploration projects. It's impossible to do that. Our program is practical. It's doable, but it's also bold. We have to act.
Mr. O'Toole, you want to freeze the carbon tax established by the Liberals and establish a savings account where the more you use gasoline, the more purchase credits you get. How can you spend so much?
Personal carbon account, well, it's your money. And if you transfer your money from your account, then it's still your money. But you're going to make the decisions to reduce your carbon footprint. And this is an innovative approach. And we have to achieve our objectives. And that's why we launched our policy in April, not recently.
But a family that has 2 SUVs, they're going to be the big winners because they'll make the most out of your plan.
No, because they have to make decisions in the personal account for green purchases. And we'll work closely with the provinces, with major emitters. And we have a plan with a great deal of details, because this is an important issue for our country and for the world as a whole.
Mr. Blanchet, you would like the third link between Quebec City and Lévis to be funded by a green budget from the federal government. If that was in any other province, should you be asking, or would you be asking for the same thing?
Provincial jurisdiction. If this is where another province, chances are I wouldn't get involved, because what I'm asking for Quebec, and I'm going to repeat, and I'm ready to repeat it many times, this is a provincial jurisdiction. These infrastructures are municipal, and it's up to the Quebec state to do the consultations and the environmental assessments. And I'm convinced, and this can be done.
But the question is, a green budget from the federal government, should a green budget from the federal government fund urban sprawl?
For infrastructure development, and the government of Quebec has asked that the whole envelope of the federal government be given to the Quebec government, and Quebec will have its discussion with Lévis and Quebec and the population, the public, who will have expectations on the environmental front, and because of Quebec, of course, will have to make this project socially acceptable.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. An open debate. You can come back to the environment. I'll give you 5 figures. Mr. O'Toole, you want to reduce targets by 30%. You want to reduce emissions by 30%. Mr. Paul, 40 rather. Mr. Singh and Mr. Blanchet, 50%. Mr. Trudeau, 40%. But here's the reality. For the past 24 years, no target established by Canada has ever been reached. Mr. Trudeau, you can kick off this open debate. How can people trust you in those circumstances?
According to all experts and scientists, we're already on the way to go beyond our Paris targets. 5 years ago, we will set our limits at 40% by 2050. People know that they need a government which will take concrete action, bold action on climate change. Unfortunately, the Conservatives want to return to the Harper Plan, and they want to break the Paris agreements because under the Paris Agreement we have to continue to increase our goals, our targets. Mr. Harper wants to. Mr.
Canadians deserve a government which will actually deliver the goods, which will achieve the objectives. Every year, Mr. Trudeau failed to meet his objectives. And Canadians deserve to have a concrete plan, a specific plan. That's why we launched our plan in April with a carbon price. And we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And we have to achieve our Paris objectives. That's very important for me.
By investing in Northern Gateway, in the Northern Gateway pipeline.
It's not just rhetoric here, what I'm saying. We have to deliver on these important issues for Canadians and Quebecers.
Mr. Singh.
I'm saying something rather bizarre. I am in full agreement with Mr. O'Toole that Mr. Trudeau missed each of his targets. But Mr. O'Toole will do the same thing. And I want to tell you a story of how this is a real issue. I met a young lady in Hamilton. She said, "What? Why should I carry on study, find a partner of life, start a family when I'm afraid for the future? I have no idea what's going to happen in the future." That is the issue here. So we can't just talk about someone who's full of good words, but with no concrete action.
We understand. Mr. Blanchet.
Well, I think that we're using Kyoto 1990 for setting goals, and now we've set a threshold that's much higher. So we say 37.5% over the preceding ceiling. That's about what the Americans are committed to do. So Canada isn't really ready to go as far as the Americans do, who are also great consumers of gas and petroleum. So I think we need a little more courage. There are controlled mechanisms like the cap-and-trade system.
I would like to speak to this point, and I want to speak to Canadians sincerely and directly. I'm sure that your intuition tells you that this doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. And Canada, first of all, is missing a historic opportunity to be at the cutting edge of a green economy. And also, we are on a road to nowhere. It's up to you to decide. Do you want to continue on this same road for another few years, or do you want to change direction? And really, this is a choice. I'm sorry, Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau, to say that all the scientists agree, even the scientists in the public service have said that with your plan, we will not even reach half of your target.
Well, the reality is that all plans from leaders here this evening are based on magic, except the Liberal plan. Listen to the experts, listen to scientists, listen to climate experts. They're all saying that the Liberal Party has the only plan, the only bold plan to deal with climate change, and the other parties don't have the plan we need to deal with climate change.
Mr. Trudeau, thank you.
So, they haven't succeeded in 6 years.
The best of luck to people who will try this. I asked you about the Trans Mountain pipeline because even you, Mr. Singh, are saying that you will have to keep it operational. How many years will you keep it operational?
I said that I'm against the project.
But it's there.
I'm still against it.
So you would shut down the pipeline?
I'm against it, and I've said that.
But what will happen to it?
Okay, if we're the government, we'll have a look at the situation, but
Mr.
we're against
Trudeau.
it.
How many years?
Well, Aboriginal communities want to buy the pipeline. They'll continue to operate it until we no longer need it, because we will make sure there's a transition to bring down emissions from the gas and oil sector.
Understand if it's going to keep operating for what, 15, 20 years, Mr. O'Toole?
Companies in Western Canada deserve an economic recovery also, and it's possible to create jobs while at the same time reducing our emissions.
Thank you. That concludes the segment.
Yes. I would offer it to the people of Alberta so that they can do their own energy transition.
Thank you.
Because they
We'll move on to the next
Trans Mountain? Yes. As for Trans Mountain, this is a project that is not even give 1 cent of revenue. And also, furthermore, this violates the Wet'suwet'en sovereignty.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. We'll move on to the next topic. Indigenous issues, identity, and culture. I'll take this opportunity to tell people that we are in the gallery of the Canadian Museum of History. It's a gallery dedicated to Indigenous people. This is why you saw parts of totem poles, and on some screens they're visible. You have a question from a member of the public. Yes. We were all deeply shaken by the discovery of the graves of Indigenous children. Hundreds of them have been found on the sites of former residential schools, and it's obvious that we need to do a great deal to come to some kind of reconciliation. Our next guest is from the community of Kanesatake. He's with us in Montreal. Mr. Simon, good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much for being here today. The last few months have been extremely difficult for you, not only because of residential schools and their discoveries, but because of the death of Joyce Echaquan in hospital in Joliette. You are carrying a feather, and it means it is your turn to speak in the circle. So please go ahead. The floor is yours. In 2021, today, it is time to recognize that we exist and that we share this territory, which is the land of our ancestors. We share it with Canadians and Quebecers. To engage in and begin genuine reconciliation, would you be ready to include the languages of First Nations, Inuit and Métis, in the official languages of Canada? Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Simon. That is a very complex subject and a clear and simple question. Mr. Blanchette, you begin.
Mr. Simon, Monsieur Simon, good evening and thank you for your invitation. From nation to nation, I accept your invitation. So, whatever concerns Quebec will have to be discussed with Quebec, and Bill C-96 doesn't change this. But let me tell you that you use the words we share the same territory, and that's the reality. So we need to coexist to our mutual benefit, all nations, the Quebec nation, the First Nations, and Canada, on the same territory. So in that spirit, my answer is clearly yes. On the territory that is presently either Quebec or Canada, First Nation languages should be recognized officially, and they should have jurisdiction.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchette. Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simon, for being here with us this evening, and thank you for your leadership. The reality is that we've worked to co-develop with Aboriginal peoples across the country protections and an official status for Aboriginal languages. But I'd like to share a concrete example with you this evening. For me, advocating for bilingualism, French and English in Canada, is very, very important. And we took the decision. It was a difficult one to appoint a Governor General who doesn't speak both of our official languages. She speaks English and Inuktitut. She learned that in northern Quebec when she was young. That shows, I think, just to what extent we have to value these languages and cultures.
Thank you. Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Simon, for your presence here today. You're adding something special and important to this meeting, and I agree fully that we have to recognize the Indigenous languages as official languages. It's just a little thing that we could do, but I think it could have profound impacts, because what we have to do for justice towards Indigenous people are great measures. We have to follow all the calls for action of the Truth and Reconciliation report and settle the problems related to Indigenous schools.
Thank you. Ms. Paul?
Thank you. Mr. Simon, thank you for your question. As a person who is part of a diaspora where we've lost our culture and our languages, I sincerely recognize the importance of keeping one's language. So absolutely, I even hesitate to comment because I'm always trying to speak about our platform and allow Indigenous leaders to speak for themselves. I hope one day that there will be a leader coming from one of our First Nations, because it's time for this leadership. So yes, absolutely. We are allies for sovereignty and for nation-to-nation engagement and self-determination.
Mr. O'Toole?
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Miigwech. Reconciliation is a priority for all leaders here this evening. My first question in the House of Commons, as Leader of the Opposition, dealt with reconciliation. And we have to act on the calls for action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I will act on this. We have to provide specific services in the traditional indigenous languages. And 2 weeks ago, we announced a historic investment in mental health for indigenous people, for services in traditional languages.
Will these indigenous languages become official languages in this country, Mr. O'Toole? Should they be recognized as official languages?
Well, it's possible to have services in indigenous languages.
Thank you. Mr. Simon, thank you very much for having spoken tonight. It was both courageous and eloquent. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Simon. We are now going to open the floor to everyone in 2 5-minute segments because I want things to be as clear as possible for our viewers. I will ask you to talk about 2 important issues: water in the reserves and the territories, the Wet'suwet'en crisis, for example. Mr. Singh, drinking water, random draw, we begin with you. The Auditor General said once again that the issue is not settled, even though there has been money set aside for it. What can you say?
You said Mr. Singh, but you're looking at someone else.
Mr. Singh. Yes, you had said you were surprised and you agreed with Mr. Singh.
So Mr.
Yes,
Singh, it is you.
The floor is yours,
Thank
Mr. Singh.
you, Patrice. I was joking a little bit, but it is a very serious issue. And here, I'd like to say very clearly that in a rich country such as ours, it's totally unexcusable that all Indigenous communities don't have access to drinking water. So in my opinion, it's not a question of capabilities, competencies. It's a question of willpower, political will. And so when Mr. Trudeau, during the first weeks of the pandemic, he immediately acted to give $750 million of backstop money for banks, but he broke his promise to deliver drinking water to Indigenous communities. So I do not accept that it was a lack of capacity, but rather a lack of will. And it's a shame, a shame.
Mr. Trudeau, the Auditor General, is talking about an outdated funding formula.
Well, for decades now, we've been going through this problem with drinking water on Aboriginal reserves. That's why we promised to put an end to it. We've eliminated 109 boil water advisories across the country. There are a few more to lift. We're working actively in all communities. We have a plan. We have a representative that's doing the work on the ground. We will get there. Of course, the pandemic has delayed us somewhat, but that's not an excuse. We'll see this job through.
Mr. O'Toole, the floor is yours.
Yes, Mr. Trudeau broke his promises on drinking water. And reconciliation, well, it's based on trust between the First Nations and the federal government. And that's why it's very important to have a plan. Not just rhetoric, but you have to be able to deliver the goods, because drinking water on the reserves is a right. And you have to deliver this, you have to respect this in partnership with Indigenous leaders, with Indigenous businesses. And I'll create a plan to deliver this in a partnership.
Thank you. Ms. Paul?
Once again, I'm speaking directly to Canadians, and I would like to say that this is why we need more diversity in our political scene. If we had more people who lived without potable drinking water in politics, this would be high on the priority list. There is political will that's missing here. Our investment in the TMX pipeline is much more costly than paying for drinking water in each Indigenous community.
We have the right to evaluate government on the results that it produces. So with the support of the House of Commons, this should have been settled, but it's found ways of spending hundreds of millions of dollars. But even after all these years, it hasn't found the way of finding the financial and human resources to settle this issue of safe water supply in Aboriginal communities. It's an international shame, and all of these electoral promises amount to nothing. So this should be settled to the satisfaction
during
of
the
impacted communities.
Segment. During the next leaders' debate, rather, that question shouldn't need to be asked again. Railways were blockaded in Canada. Mr. Trudeau, have negotiations moved forward?
Because we stood up to calls from the Conservatives and others to send in the army, to send in the police. We spent time negotiating that. Took a few more days, of course, but even during that crisis, which lasted several days, more than a week in fact, we were able to resolve it in a peaceful manner, in a harmonious fashion as well. And we're continuing to work hand in hand in partnership respectfully. It's the only way to move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. We'll come back to this in the next 5-minute segment. Guillaume Bourgon-Côté is with us from L'Actualité to ask his questions. Good evening, Mr. O'Toole. On culture, you promised to go back and start again with a bill to tax the web giants like Spotify and Amazon. You want them to reinvest significant amounts of their revenue to invest in Canadian music and films and shows. This is much more than the 830 million.
I'm proud of our artists, Quebec artists, Canadian artists, and also the content. And we have to balance the situation between us and the web while respecting freedom of expression. And that's why we'll work with the cultural sector so as to protect our economy and to help our artists, but at the same time respecting freedom of expression.
Do you have a financial target? How much would you like to see invested by the web giants?
We will help those sectors hardest hit by the pandemic, particularly artists and musicians. And we'll help artists who are in a critical situation. That's part of our plan for Canada's recovery.
Ms. Paul, French is the official language of Quebec, of course. Why do you hesitate about having it recognized as such in the Constitution?
I don't hesitate at all. Both of my children are part of the Francophonie. My mother did so many things so that I would be bilingual. It's so important to protect French, to reinforce French, and unfortunately, it becomes almost impossible to have bilingual education.
But I'm talking about having French as an official language for Quebec enshrined as such in the Constitution.
If you're speaking about Bill 96, what I said is that there are constitutional issues that are raised. They have to be examined.
So you have no problem with the issues substantively?
No, not at all.
Recognized as Quebec's official language in the Constitution. Mr. Singh, you condemn Quebec bashing, but when one of your members supports a statement made by a professor to the effect that Quebecers are racist, you let that go. What will you say to Quebecers who believe you're saying one thing and then the opposite?
I've always said that I'm against any Quebec bashing. All of our deputies are against Quebec bashing, and we said it's systemic discrimination. In no place do we want that. We'll always be an ally for Quebec and Quebecers to defend the French language, to defend the interest of Quebecers. It's something that touches me deeply because it's part of our values. Jack Layton started with the Sherbrooke Declaration, and we continue along the same lines. And we fully believe that Quebec has the right to withdraw from any federal program with full compensation.
But why
did you not scold your MP
to order
who is
the member
associated
who
with
made those
Quebec bashing?
statements?
I spoke to him, and he recognized his error, and we continue to say clearly that we're a party that is an ally to Quebec.
Thank you. Mr. Blanchet, the court challenge program helps people defend their rights when they're in a minority, as we saw with the defense of the Montfort Hospital. You are, believe you believe that Quebec should interfere in the management of this program so that the Secularism Act in Quebec is not attacked.
Well, I'm going
so
to
do you
repeat
believe
what
in
I
the
said,
program only when it
yesterday
suits you, Mr. Blanchet?
Media Scrum. First of all, the Bloc Québécois has always been for the Court Challenge program, but the government has given it to an institution who made it a political weapon against Quebec values, and so it goes against Bill 21 on secularism or Bill 96, and that's a real problem for an institution that allows the Professor Atalant making all kinds of comments. And so either the future minister has to change the governance model so that it remains independent, but don't give it to an institution that is going to indulge in
Quebec minorities, in your view, therefore have the right of having their
so you agree
challenges
with the principle?
funded
yes, there's a
when they
hell
want
of a difference
to
between saying we're going
fight
to give
Bill
250,000 to a school district that wants to challenge a Quebec law that is where Quebec has jurisdiction. And
Thank
that's
you,
very different
Mr.
from the situation
Trudeau.
at the Hotel Montfort.
For the past 4 years, you have been promising that the web giants will fund Canadian cultural content. And yet nothing has changed in those 4 years. You had a bill that was not passed because you called an election. Are you serious about doing this, Mr.
I think
Trudeau?
that artists in Quebec and across the country all know just how much we've been there for them during the pandemic and also prior to the pandemic. We reversed the horrible trend of Conservative governments to go after artists. We were there to support CBC. We were there for artists as well. We've made sure that web giants invest more in Quebec, and what we're currently doing is working with the international community to make sure that all these companies pay their fair share in tax. We've tabled Bill C-10, which was delayed because of the Conservatives and the other parties who weren't always ready to make it a priority. We were there for artists, will continue to be so.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Guillaume. There was an article by Thomas Gervais, Radio-Canada, which surprised and shocked a lot of people. A school commission in Northern Ontario burned books in the name of reconciliation. Mr. Blanchet, should a leader have a clear position on this sort of thing?
Now, having said that, I'm rather satisfied because the interventions that I did yesterday, whether it be the Quebec Anglophone School Board that said I want to recognize the Quebec culture or burning books is not a good idea, so they backed off, and that's very... So I have a lot of books. I collect a lot more that I will have time to read in my lifetime. But I think that we have to confront what is found in our literature and what our past is that what is said that is not representative of who we are. So we need to prepare our children to and inculcate some better values.
Is it not your duty as leader yesterday morning to clearly condemn the book burning, because we can't do just anything in the name of reconciliation,
That's right? And I said clearly that it's completely unacceptable to burn books. At the same time, we're not going to tell Aboriginal peoples how they should feel. We have to find a balance. That's very, very important.
Mr. O'Toole.
Burning of books is always unacceptable in a society like our society, which should be focusing on reconciliation without that kind of behavior.
Ms. Paul, what is your
First of all,
feeling?
Yesterday there was a Jewish holiday, and so I was not aware of this until today. There are better ways to express things, but we know that there's a lot of frustration in Indigenous communities, in the Black community as well. When we wait for decades for action to be taken on criminal justice, on reconciliation, we become frustrated. And it's time for action. So I hope that we will be able to find more productive ways to do this, but we have to find solutions.
Mr. Singh, I'd like to hear everyone.
I don't think burning a book is a good idea, not at all. I think that we should look at history and know what were the things that people did in the past. But I do understand deeply how the indigenous peoples have problems with how people were taught about them and taught about their culture. In my childhood, what I learned was not respectful to the dignity and the contributions, the knowledge of indigenous peoples. So we have to have a serious conversation on how we should teach the contribution of indigenous peoples.
The lady who said this, Ms. Trudeau, was on the Reconciliation Commission and was a member of the Liberal Party.
She was a volunteer.
She's no longer there.
No,
she's a
resigned.
Volunteer.
Ça montre qu'il peut y avoir des dérives avec trop de bons sentiments.
So people, for the right reasons, can do the wrong thing.
I'm always very, very careful when you make decisions as to identifying with a specific issue. You have to leave a lot of space for personal identity. I'm not defending what the person did, but everyone has to be careful, I think.
The last word?
Mr. Trudeau says we mustn't tell First Nations what to say and what to do. So why is he telling the Quebec Nation what to think and what to do?
I am a Quebecer, Mr. Blanchet. This is something that you tend to forget.
You're constantly doing this.
I'm a very proud Quebecer. I've always been a Quebecer. I'll always be a Quebecer. I'm here, and I have my own opinion. You don't represent all interests in Quebec. We represent many Quebecers in the House of Commons. Mr. Blanchet.
It's a question of democracy, Mr. Trudeau.
You say you're the only real Quebecer here. You're not.
Relax.
You said that you don't want federal interference in Quebec, and then you criticize our government. You're very, very contradictory. No, you can't accuse me of not being a Quebecer.
Democracy, Quebec democracy is expressed at the National Assembly.
And also in the Parliament of Canada as well, Mr.
Blanchet.
So it is the will of the National Assembly of Quebec when it comes that has precedence in matters of language and culture.
I'm the only leader here who can replace Mr. Trudeau. And we have to act for Quebec.
Yes, you have a contract.
Merci, Monsieur Singh.
So you say.
Debates do have to be lively. Thank you, Mr. Singh. And we'll move to the next topic.
Justice et affaires étrangères.
Justice and Foreign Affairs. Noémie, we have a question from the public. Yes, the evacuation of Afghanistan ended in chaos. There are still 250 Canadians and their families still there. And to that number, we have to add almost 10,000 Afghans who helped Canada and who fear for their lives now that the Taliban are back in power. Kathleen Rask is the sister of Captain Nicola Goddard, who was killed in combat in Kandahar. She is in Vancouver today. Good evening, Ms. Rask. You have founded an organization that assists these Afghan civilians. You are trying to bring the interpreter who worked with your sister to Canada. What is your question for the leaders tonight? Canada waited far too long before taking action. The most important thing to my sister was her responsibility to her team. And as far as she was concerned, interpreters were part of her team. She would never have wanted them to be abandoned. What will you do to evacuate Canadians and Afghan interpreters who were left behind? Thank you for the question, Ms. Rask. Ms. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the question. And I would say that I never would have called for an election when we had Canadians and people who have supported us during our mission in Afghanistan. I had already asked all the leaders of the other parties to participate in an emergency debate on this, but you're absolutely correct. Canada has to keep its promises. We have to do this. Otherwise, we won't be allies. We won't have any international partners. Now is the time to focus on the evacuation of our nationals and also those who helped us.
Thank you. Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Madam Rask, and thank you for the service of your family. It's incomprehensible what took place. The fact that these people are allies who, at the risk of their life, helped our Canadian forces and have now been abandoned. It is unacceptable that happened. Now, we saw the images of what happened in Afghanistan at the end. It's a tragedy for human rights. People are threatened and are afraid for their lives. So I agree with Madame Paul that we should never have had an election, and now we have to do everything we can to save the lives of our allies.
Thank you. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you for your question, Ms. Rouse. The situation in Afghanistan is very sad for the women, for the girls there, and also for our veterans and their families. Unfortunately, Mr. Trudeau abandoned. He abandoned the interpreters and the people working on the ground. And unfortunately, months ago, our veterans, in fact, demanded an action plan on Afghanistan. However, Mr. Trudeau called an election. He ignored the problem, and as usual, he did nothing. And as a veteran myself, I will act on our interests in Canada and around the world.
Thank you. Mr. Trudeau?
Well, Ms. Rusk, I understand your sorrow and your frustration as well. Canadians have made a lot of sacrifices to improve the fate of the Afghan people. Your family has sacrificed more than it should have ever had to sacrifice. So I understand your sorrow. I understand the desire of all Canadians to continue to help in Afghanistan. This is what we will do. We acted very, very quickly. Right from the outset, we organized evacuation flights. We got out 2,300 people, more than our European allies. But we have to continue to be there to get not only Canadians, but to get the tens of thousands of other people that we intend to welcome here to Canada.
Thank you. Mr. Blanchet?
What can we do, Madame Ross? Well, we have to recognize that Canada is not an international power. And that's a problem, because that means that Canada cannot act alone. It has to do so in partnership with its allies. And our relationship with China and with the United States have suffered. And Saudi Arabia is a pitiful example of the Canadian conduct. And so 90 countries have said that they would not recognize the Taliban regime and that are ready to exert pressure on the regime. So are the concerted efforts to make sure that we will force the Taliban regime to release the interpreters. And that's the only solution.
Thank you, Mr. Blanchet. Thank you, Ms. Rusk, for having brought us this message tonight.
Merci,
Thank you.
Madame Ross. Vraiment, merci. J'appelle Marie Vastel du
Thank
Devoir
you.
à venir poser ses questions.
Marie Vastel of Le Devoir will now ask her questions. Good evening, Mr. Blanchet. I'll begin with you.
Yes.
On immigration,
So
you want to promote French-speaking immigrants for Quebec, but we know that most refugees don't speak French when they're outside the country. What would you do?
I would like to introduce a small
Canada to
nuance
restore.
here. I think that Canada should re-establish and stop penalizing the Francophone students from abroad that want to come here, because they're refused. Up to 80% are being refused. They are Francophone and they want to come to Quebec. It's a kind of administrative discrimination that really hinders us and hinders French. So as to the welcoming of immigrants, I'm very open to the idea, but it's important to be able to integrate them.
Talks about welcoming French-speaking refugees. Does that mean you would receive fewer than you share?
It means that we will do everything that we can so that the maximum number of immigrants are Francophones. That doesn't mean that we're not going to take our responsibilities. And so, what are the resources that we can invest to help franchise the immigrants that choose to come to Quebec?
You would like to become Prime Minister of a G7 country, but your election platform simply has a few very generalized notions on foreign policy. So what do you think the next government should do first?
If we're talking about what we can do on the world stage, Mr. Trudeau said that Canada is back, but At this point in time, our level of investment for international development and assistance is very low. It's not at the level that we should be having as a G7 country. So we would increase that, and also to regain our position as a diplomatically minded country that defends the interests of human rights with good concrete actions.
And on China, very quickly, you say you should face up to China. What does that mean?
We had a vote to recognize the genocide against the Uyghur in the House. Mr. Trudeau is not in the House. In fact, his whole cabinet was absent, which shows a lack of leadership, in my opinion.
Thank you. Mr. Trudeau, you were not even consulted when President Biden of the U.S. decided that the U.S. would keep its border with Canada closed. So how can you defend the interests of Canada if you cannot even talk directly with Joe Biden when it counts?
Quite the opposite, in fact, Marie. I've often talked to President Biden about our borders to coordinate as much as possible with him. It's not up to the U.S. to tell us how to manage our borders. It's not up to us to tell the Americans how to manage their border either. But I would point out that during the pandemic, Canadians were free to take a flight to Florida, be they vaccinated or not. There was great asymmetry right from the outset. We put in place compulsory quarantine. The Americans didn't have that.
Regarding your relationship with President Biden, he took only 3 calls.
No, quite the opposite. We spent a whole day together. When he was elected, it was one of his first meetings, in fact, to set out the path that we would take together. Our relationship with the U.S. is very, very good.
Thank you. Ms. Paul, the Israel issue almost caused your party to implode recently, and unlike you, your activists would like the party to take a hard line towards Israel. What is your position?
First of all, I don't really accept the characterization. The Green Party is a party of dialogue, of non-violence, of reconciliation, and we apply that in all situations. We are also a party that believes in international law. As a former diplomat for our country and as an advisor to the International Criminal Court, I am a person who follows international law.
But on Israel specifically, Ms. Paul, your position is not set out in the platform. What is it?
We don't have a position on any issue or any international conflict in our platform.
All right,
we have principles, and
thank you.
This is what we apply.
Thank you. Mr. O'Toole, on China, to conclude, you say that you would take a harder line with China, but even our allies don't go as far as what you're proposing to do. Don't you fear that, in fact, there would be more economic sanctions and more Canadians taken hostage?
No. We have to have a stronger approach to China. Mr. China was always, his position was always consistent on China. He missed the vote, for example, on genocide in China. On our allies, we really opposed at Huawei and the 5G. We were only a country of the Five Eyes in favor of Huawei. So we really have to balance the playing field here on international trade. So in order to allow aluminium to go in. Mr. Obama started this, but constantly Mr. Trudeau.
But we've seen sanctions, we've seen reprisals. Would there not be more of them?
We have to defend our values. We have to defend our citizens. And the Magnitsky sanctions are very important as a way of acting against the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Marie. We have little time left. The final open debate, ladies and gentlemen, this will go quickly. Firearms. The mayor of Montreal has joined her voice to other mayors like Régis Labaume of Quebec City. They all say they're very concerned. Madame Plante says that it's becoming a U.S.-style society. There are too many firearms about. Mr. Labaume says we shouldn't wait for this country to become like the Wild West. The firearms prohibited by Mr. Trudeau, Mr. O'Toole, will you keep them on the prohibited list for your entire term?
I'm going to maintain the restrictions which are currently in place for firearms, and I will remove our politics from the system. And the mayors are right. We have to focus on street gangs and smuggling also, and we have a plan to do that, in close cooperation with police services, with municipalities also, because we've seen shootings in Montreal, in Vancouver, with weapons.
You changed your platform three times.
We have to have
on
a
this.
transparent approach, because we have to take politics out of this.
Mr. Blanchette, on this?
I have a plan and a contract, and once it's signed, I'm going to change it. What do you think? This is a new leader, but the same party, same results. At least the Liberals finally accepted the idea that with assault weapons you have to be very clear. And so we have to ban handguns and assault rifles. And so we have to eradicate this danger and make because right now the streets of Montreal are a staging ground for war, gang wars.
With regard to handguns, for years mayors have been saying, don't dump this on us, take care of it yourself and prohibit them across Canada.
Well, that we've always been there to strengthen gun control, and we'll continue to do that. Yes, we have offered the opportunity to mayors to prohibit handguns in their cities, and now we're going to allow provinces that want to, like Quebec, the ability to ban handguns. But here there's an issue of leadership here, where Mr. O'Toole has refused to tell Quebecers what he intends to do. He's refused to tell Canadians what he intends to do. He's making deals with special interest groups on vaccines.
That's not true. That's not the case at all.
He says he's pro-choice, but 80 of his members voted against the right of women to choose. He wants to take us back on climate change to the Harper era. It's weak leadership. That's what he's offering. And now his platform is finally costed, and now he is not investing in Canadian priorities.
Mr.
He
Trudeau,
can't be
please.
believed on this.
Mr. O'Toole, please reply.
Mr. Trudeau will say anything at all just to win. I'm pro-choice. I will act on public safety because we've seen an increase in shootings because of illegal guns. We've seen an increase also in smuggling at the border. We've seen people crossing illegally. We have to have a serious approach.
He says he's a pro-choice leader. He doesn't have the support of his members of parliament. They don't agree with him. He doesn't even have all of his members who are vaccinated. That's not leadership, Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. O'Toole.
Why are we in an election campaign, Mr. Trudeau?
6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Both parties are saying the same thing. There's another option in this election. Mr. Trudeau promised that he would buy back the weapons, but he broke his promise.
That's what we did. That's what we did.
But this is Trudeau again breaking his promise. How can people believe him? And at this point in time, I say clearly that for the future, we can't allow ourselves to have 4 more years of this kind of approach of saying one thing, doing another thing, making big promises and doing nothing. We can't carry on like that.
On firearms?
On firearms. First of all, I entered into political life with great sincerity. Not to play partisan politics, if we're talking about handguns and assault weapons, we need to abolish. We need to respect what the mayors are asking for, but we also have to strike at the heart of the issue: inequality, the lack of affordable housing, things that lead to criminality in the first place. This is the issue. Are we going to go to the heart of the issue? Are we going to change things, or are we going to treat the symptoms?
Everybody has spoken on firearms. I would very much like to ask a question on francophones living in minority linguistic communities. Will you add places like the University of Sudbury, University of Moncton, other campuses that are vulnerable? Mr. O'Toole.
Yes, we have a fund in our plan to help Francophone minority communities, coast to coast. They are a strength for our country. And also, we're going to modernize the Official Languages Act. After 6 years of inaction with Mr. Trudeau, Francophone communities outside Quebec deserve to be given money.
20 seconds each, please.
Saint-Jean campus, the Ontario Francophone University. It was conservative policies that cut Francophone rights. He won't stand up to Blaine Higgs and to Jason Kenney. We will always be there to defend Francophones.
As a mother of a Francophone son, I say yes, yes, yes. I really love the French language, and we need to protect it. We have to make sure that everyone has access to bilingual education if they want it.
Another good word for Mr. Trudeau, but on the ground in Sudbury, his team wasn't there to defend the French language, to defend these institutions. Our team was there, and we will always defend the Francophone institutions because they enrich our society. The beautiful language of Molière, which is a great advantage.
Thank you. Mr. Blanchette, the last word.
The Bloc Québécois will continue to promote the only law that is of importance for minorities, Francophone minorities outside of Quebec. So the law on linguistic minorities should focus on these Francophones outside of Quebec, and we will deal with our own minorities inside of Quebec.
Are clearer on what people, our party leaders believe. This is a very valuable exercise. I believe it has been clear. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being so disciplined. We'll see you next on September 20th, the day of the vote. Please vote. And thank you all.
All right, thank you for listening to this particular podcast over the French language debate to happen on September 9th in Ottawa. And we hope that this helps you decide to vote. We hope that it helps you make a decision. And remember, September 20th is the hard date that we really have to get out there and vote, and that early elections are starting as soon as September 10th. So thank you for listening, and go out and vote. Thank you for listening today, and thank you for supporting us with our sponsors. Please go to depictions.media for more information, and click on our contact link and let us know how we can help bring your story and help bring us to a better world. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.